Disinformation has been a major part of Russia's assault on Ukraine since 2014. It continues to be a threat to victory against Russian aggression in Ukraine and around the world, threatens information security and social stability. Disinformation rarely promotes a single cause or idea, but seeks to pour petrol on the flames of conflicts, inciting internal divisions which countries that are designated enemies of Russia. It can even threaten election results and undermine democratic institutions. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. It will really help increase the popularity of our content in the algorithms. Our material is also now being made available on popular podcasting platforms as well, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Valeria Kovtun has led the launch of the first state media literacy organization in Ukraine called Filter, which aims to make society more resilient to misinformation. Valeria was formerly a journalist at BBC Real, a senior correspondent at major Ukrainian media organizations, and a fellow journalist at the United Nations. She also has a background in video production, content management, and news broadcasting. Valeria Kovtun has studied law, media communications, and journalism at several prestigious institutions, including the Kyiv National Economics University, the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, and the London School of Economics. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
Well, before we explore Filter in detail, I'd like to ask how you got into this area of research. What really attracts you to it?
So before going to London, I worked in journalism, as you mentioned. So I basically saw how media organizations work from inside, and I saw what doesn't work. So the idea has always been there with me. I kind of felt their need to change media culture in Ukraine, to change the media environment, to help people consume information in a smarter way and help media organizations produce a better quality materials. So this is when Filter came into my life. Basically, it wasn't Filter, it was just an idea from the government. They wanted to devote more of their time and resources to media literacy. And it was in 2020 when they announced this idea. And my core goal was to create something out of it, to launch a project which would be recognizable by Ukrainians, which would have a clear idea and which would help Ukrainians understand why they need this media literacy, which in the Ukrainian language sounds very boring and very, I would even say, opposite to, I mean, it doesn't encourage you to do anything with it. It's called media gramotность, and the word itself is super long and super boring, so we had to deal with that. So we had to slowly build a brand and then work with it with different audiences in Ukraine.
It sounds quite academic in English as well. I think the other phrase that's being used, which is, media resilience or digital resilience, is kind of equally off-putting as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. Still, there are two words at least in Ukrainian. It's one and it's super long. So from communication point of view, it's very hard to communicate it. So that is why we came up with a brand called Filter, which refers to one of the most common words used by Ukrainians when they are talking about disinformation. They would address this topic with lots of words with filter in them. So since it already was familiar and something which they were eager to use, we just didn't think for too long, just took this word and played around it.
That's like filtering facts from fiction, filtering the propaganda narrative from verifiable information.
In general, it's a lot about abundance of information, and people are overloaded and they feel depressed. And then before the war, they felt super depressed from COVID and all these other related news to COVID. So we just wanted to help them filter out the most necessary information and news. And in order to do that, they would need to learn more about media literacy and exercise critical thinking.
Now, your professional career has really been, I mean, Ukraine's been involved in either a sort of local conflict or localized conflict and now a full-scale conflict pretty much for the entirety of your career. I mean, how has that affected you?
Firstly, I would say it's not a conflict. It's always been a war since 2014. It's a war of Russia against Ukraine, and now it's a full-scale war. So basically, yeah, living in the times of war is quite challenging. But at the same time, especially after 24th of February, we see that demand for media literacy and quality news has increased very much in Ukraine. And if in before 24th of February, we actually struggled to explain to people in simple way why media literacy matters and how it can improve their lives here and now. After 24th, people started coming to us from businesses, from education, from various fields, asking for training sessions, for materials, because they felt the need to improve their media literacy. They didn't refer to this problem as media literacy. They were saying, I need to learn more about some instruments for fact checking. Where can I learn news in my region? I mean, we realize that when you are in a small town or village and situation changes dynamically every hour, the Russian soldiers were advancing. So today you might be in a territory controlled by Ukraine, and in a couple of hours it might be controlled by Russia. So people had felt the need to verify information and to check it very frequently, and they didn't know where to do it. So we felt that, people clearly realized the connection between media literacy and their personal security and security of their loved ones. And that's when we started providing them with all the possible platforms and instruments for fact-checking information, something which they could do easily themselves, so that they didn't need some extra, skills for that. And it worked super well. Hundreds of people would come to the lectures which we were holding, or to some express lessons, as we call them, and listen to what was available at that time for them to fact check information really very quickly.
And Filter's now a year old and the project has really taken off. I mean, how does that feel to have seen something you've helped to plan, build, invent, really sort of scale up?
Yeah, it actually warms my heart a lot, because I feel lots of things have changed. If at the very beginning of the project people didn't know about us, our partners and other NGOs were a bit suspicious, because everything which comes from the government is normally perceived that way. So we were not an exclusion. So at that time, Filter was something new, unknown. Now we managed to to coordinate all the efforts, media literacy efforts in Ukraine. We are working on the media literacy strategy for Ukraine for next 5 years. We hold regular meetings with the media organizations and with NGOs and international partners. And at the same time, we managed to build different communities on different platforms who all know about Filter and who normally are happy to interact with us, which is something quite rare these days. So we see people being thankful for the content we provide them with. When they come and seek some advice, we are happy to provide them with all possible materials which they can use in their work. So it actually, it's a great feeling to realize that people actually use this knowledge which we provide them with, and this knowledge helps them to be safe. And that's the key, like the best reward you can get from this 1 year work.
So what are the core materials? What's the majority of your effort? What does that go into? Is it in the creation and dissemination of materials? Do you directly run training sessions? Could you describe a bit about how Filter actually works?
So before the war, we had different formats. We tried to work with various audiences to see what works for who. So basically, we experimented with different formats, and we launched media literacy clubs in the regions where there would be participants of 40 plus, so more like older people who live in rural areas, and they would come to the club to meet their colleagues and talk about life and local news. But at the same time, the leaders of the clubs were instructed to lead these conversations through 10 rules of media literacy, which they had learned before launching these clubs. So we had this type of a format, and at the same time we worked very much with young people. So it's again like training sessions for them, various competitions, school interventions at schools. We worked with the Minister of Education and Science of Ukraine, where we would have flash mobs for teachers, where they were encouraged to use materials in their during the lessons. Or we would have all Ukrainian national media literacy lesson, where all schools at the same time held a lesson, and then they went to our platform where we collected all the best materials. So over 100,000 teachers actually used the materials which we combined in one platform, and lots of other things. But when the war came, we had to actually focus on quick responses and quick solutions. So we started combating disinformation, and we provided people with very, very easy solutions. At that time, they didn't have neither wish nor time to think much, to analyze much. People were shocked. They were very emotional. So we wanted for them to have everything accessible, available. So what we did, we just had 40 minutes lessons and trainings where we were explaining them how to verify information, what type of tactics Russia was using in this information war, how to detect their narratives, how bots can be detected, and how to make sure you're not responding to a bot and stuff like that. So something which was very relevant, and we combined all these experiences in one 40-minute lecture, or we called it a lesson. Also, we knew that people, many of them were there were still air raid sirens, so people would need to go to shelter. So because of that, we wanted to make it as short as possible, because we didn't know, the situation was changing very, very quickly. So that was it. And then, of course, combating disinformation and historical myths on all our platform. We started investing more in Instagram. We actually launched TikTok platform to interact with younger people, and it was going very well. And we launched LinkedIn just to communicate something in English, because we had some requests from international media and some experts asking us to provide some information on what was happening inside of Ukraine in this information battlefield, and Facebook as well. So we were trying to be everywhere to spread this information about the tactics which Russia was using in the information war. And apart from that, we started working with international audiences. So I was holding lectures in universities in the EU and UK, having discussions with the students, trying to provide them with more context on the war, and especially on the information war, because we are all part of it anyway.
Yes, I think, the more I hear about the work you're doing, the more I feel that we probably need these kind of courses in the UK as well. It sounds like you're really trying to deliver materials to a huge spread of demographics. So different people in different areas, people who would be predominantly, the first language would be Russian or Ukrainian. So again, there's slight differences in culture across the country, but also you're dealing with people of different age groups. That must be quite a challenge.
Yeah, and it is. Since the idea was to launch a project of a national scale, we had to live up to the expectations. And it's a huge challenge, because when you launch a national media literacy project and the minister announces it and the government supports it and the parliamentarians support it, it's a huge responsibility. So each and every Ukrainian expects that you would be doing something for them. But as you know, it's not possible to work simultaneously with all these audiences. So we had to prioritize, and that's what we did. We worked with one of the core audiences, the key audiences with who we wanted to work in the first year were journalists, civil servants, students, and businesses, because businesses was something unexplored, and we felt the need to present media literacy to them, to involve them, and probably spread media literacy even further through businesses. So we had this key audiences in mind, but again, after the war, things changed. So we started focusing more on younger people, because that's the audience which is most willing to learn, and this is the audience which is not only learning but also is proactive after they receive this knowledge. So we realized that with these audiences, with little investment of of resources and time, you can actually get the best response, and they keep doing things even after you finish the course, or after you finish interacting with them. So we are working with the young people mainly these days. Apart from that, we keep producing this content for Ukrainians, general audiences, and for international audiences, trying to combat disinformation and explain why Russia is doing certain things and produces historical myths and so on and so forth. Yeah, and so we plan quite a few activities for this autumn, but I don't think I'll speak much about that, because this is just planning and it requires a lot of coordination. But we definitely want to get back to policy making, and despite the fact that Ukraine is at war, we still want to create this media literacy strategy for next 5 years, something which was already written as a draft on 23rd of February, and which was focusing on various aspects of media literacy, involving various actors in it, businesses as well. So we feel the need to just change it, and hopefully it will be signed by the minister and the cabinet of ministers, so that it will be implemented, and all the actors involved will know what is their responsibility in promoting media literacy. That's a huge challenge, but at the same time, it's something which we really need very much, especially when it comes to rebuilding Ukraine and helping people to deal with disinformation, which is going to be coming more and more in next years.
Absolutely, and I'll definitely ask about that in a minute, because I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of propaganda in Russia's assault on Ukraine. But turning back to different age groups, and I think it's fascinating that you're targeting, a younger age group, those who are predominantly on the internet, many who won't be getting their news from traditional channels like television. Do you think by targeting them and the fact they're more proactive, they can then work to persuade the older generation, or when they hear propaganda narratives being repeated by parents and grandparents, they can challenge those points of view?
They absolutely can, but there's one thing about adults and elderly people, is that they normally believe that they are right. So it's very hard to persuade them that they need to, upgrade, like improve their fact-checking skills, or just generally their critical thinking. So as we did with the media literacy clubs, those leaders who launched these clubs and who were leading them after, those were the people from community who knew the context and who possessed this leadership potential already. So they managed to unite these people around the topic of media literacy. On Saturday evening, you wouldn't expect it, but there would be like 30 people discussing media literacy on Saturday evening, and all of them would be like 35 plus, 40 plus. So this is a huge responsibility for the leader. So same works with the older people, I guess. It's more about face-to-face interaction, and there needs to be someone they respect. So if this is a person they respect, they tend to follow their advice. Otherwise, if it's a younger person, and look, if it's going to be me as a leader of the project, it's not going to work, because just by default, I look younger, and I am younger indeed, so they wouldn't be willing to listen to my recommendations on how to fact check information. But at the same time, lots of people, especially older people, are watching TV. they still consume most of news from TV. So one of the plans is to actually work with a couple of TV channels in Ukraine. We did it in the past, and we want to do it again, but probably come up with some different format, like, you know, short videos where there would be a character who represents our audience, target audiences, and she would be speaking about it in a simple way, hopefully interacting with the audiences. But we are still thinking on how to do it. But yeah, this is probably the only way you could deal with the elderly people these days, especially taking into account that offline activities are not possible due to safety reasons. But definitely they would need some attention as well.
And I think what a lot of people don't realize in the West is that one of the first actions that the Russians do in occupied territories is take over television, take over the news, take over the internet. They seek to control all access to information because they understand that that is one way to weaken the local population, divide and conquer. So I assume that what you're doing is really tackling that head on, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Propaganda is a part of the war. It's an instrument in the war. And if not for propaganda inside of Russia, in Ukraine, and in the West, the war wouldn't have happened. And this what we are trying to explain to the world as well, that Russian society had over 20 years of this propaganda, and the Russian leadership was preparing its people for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and they were building image of Putin as, you know, as a hero on horse, a Hollywood savior who comes to save the Russian people from the evil West. So now we see it all we see the consequences when Russian people in some very distant cities and villages were asked what they were thinking about the war, they and the sanctions. They would say that you know, life got worse, but Mr. Putin is doing all he can. He will save us. So this is a clearly a lack of critical thinking, of, you know, any ability to build logical connections between certain facts, and this is something which doesn't come right now. It's a result of a year-long propaganda, both in Russia and now it's all around the West. And the key idea of Russian disinformation in the West is not to persuade in something, but rather confuse. As you mentioned at the beginning, if there is an avalanche of different facts which portray situation from different sides, and these are black and white and gray, gray tones of the situation, your brain, it's just normal for a human to switch off at certain point, and you stop even analyzing things. You just start doing something else, and you don't even think much about it. So that's the goal, and this is what is happening already now with the war in Ukraine. People just get tired of the news, and they stop thinking about it. And then there is energy crisis and other weak spots which Russia targets. So I guess we're gonna see even worse things coming.
That's right. They, in previous conversations I've had, or we've discussed with military experts, how Russia weaponizes everything. There isn't anything they won't weaponize, and that includes literature, music, culture. Absolutely everything is turned toxic and turned to their sort of imperial ambitions. And I think my next question is going to relate directly to that. It's not just the internal Russian population that's been bombarded with different propaganda messages. It's also Eastern Ukraine and the predominantly Russian-speaking communities. Now, again, something people I don't think realize in the West is that pretty much all Ukrainians will understand both Ukrainian and Russian, and that since the war began, most Ukrainians who may have had some sympathy for Russian culture, their eyes to an extent have been opened, and they've seen what the intent behind Russian politics actually is. But there are still some persistent propaganda narratives, aren't there? And one of them is that Russian speakers were somehow repressed and that Russian was banned in Ukraine. I mean, nothing of the sort is true. But I've spoken even to refugees of the older generation who've repeated that. They know that their own personal circumstances, they haven't been repressed. but they hear rumor or third-hand reports, which is the propaganda narrative, and they're receptive to it. So could you describe how that process works and what some of the most toxic propaganda narratives have been?
So yeah, it's so many of them, and this Russophobia is one of the most popular narratives. So basically, there is even statistics which says that the frequency of the word of the usage of word Russophobia increased since 2014. So basically, when Russia attacked Ukraine and the next Crimea, and then they actually analyzed the rhetorics of Russia, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Russia Today, and it's like a huge spike in the usage of the word Russophobia by both. So it's something which lasts for a few years already, and they promote the narrative about, I mean, this is definitely very old, the idea about Russian-speaking Ukrainians and their rights violated by the Ukrainian government. This is something definitely not new for us. And Russia has been, for years, it has been trying to divide Ukraine into two sub-countries, as if there was this Western Ukraine, which is predominantly Nazi, and then the Eastern Ukraine, which is a bunch of harmless Russian-speaking Ukrainians who might not be super much against joining Russia. And this actually worked super well for the West as well, because we could see this narrative about Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians repeated by Western media, positioning Ukraine as a country which kind of includes two subgroups, two groups, and it's not something which is happening in reality, especially after 24th of February. From my experience, lots of Russian-speaking Ukrainians are switching to the Ukrainian language because they feel the need to prove that, you know, language is also a power, soft power. So for them, it's just a language of an occupant. So they want to get rid of it, and they are switching to Ukrainian language. So, and we see Russia targeting Russian-speaking cities. Kharkiv is being shelled daily. And this is like, there is definitely no logic in it. If Russia claims it comes to protect those Russian-speaking Ukrainians whose rights are violated in Ukraine, then why Russian-speaking cities are suffering most? So it's definitely an artificial, you know, narrative, but unfortunately, it's being spread, and it's also believed in the West. But what I can say is that Russophobia is very. I know this narrative dominates Germany a lot, I feel, because there are lots of Russian Germans in Germany who support it and who spread it, and who are consumers of Russian media in particular. We could see that France suffers a lot from this Russian fake stories about Russophobia, and Italy in particular. There is one project called EU vs Disinfo, and they actually have a database of Russian fakes which are spreading being spread in EU. So according to their data, Germany is the country which has most of those fake stories. Many of them are related to Russophobia, and of course a lot of them are related to Nazis in Ukraine, the Azov battalion, you know about it. So whenever Germans hear the word Nazi, it's by default they feel the need to protest, like they just, because they have it in their mind, history related, they just react to it very negatively. So without even digging into the narrative and trying to analyze it, it's just that their brain is already having a negative perception of Azov, because Russia always portrays this as Nazi. So I guess one of the key characteristic of propaganda is that they tap into local contexts very well. They know the history. They are not super like they are not super smart in terms of framing messages and making sure they reach out to the right audiences. They just have a very big experience in this particular countries, and they try different methods, and then something works. They just bombard you with tons of different messages, and they see what works best. Same with Ukraine. We saw instructions of Russian propagandists for the other so-called commentators. They call them commentators. They hire people who then spread fakes in social media. So they instruct them on how to create fakes and how to spread them in Ukraine. And among the instructions, you could read, a fake has to be super short. Don't mention too many sentences, because humans' imagination can be better than you think. Always leave some space for people to come up with their own conclusions. Especially when it was related to the war, they said mention some town or village so that you sound more credible. It doesn't matter if there is no infrastructure in this village for the Russian vehicles to move. Still mention the name so you sound more credible, and then you have to repeat it. They said repeat it as many times as you can, because if it's repeated, people tend to take it as something they've already heard, so they tend to believe it after some time. And lots of other instructions which tell me that probably they already know our psychology very well, and they tested different things, so they know what works best. And they spread it publicly, openly, so that everyone can read it, which is quite stupid, but still, I mean, we saw them, and we kind of share these tactics with the Ukrainians as well, so that they know.
Absolutely. This is the area which, I mean, it's probably the wrong word to say fascinating, because it's scary, but this is the area that aligns best with what I do as a day job, and that's marketing. In marketing, you don't have a moral point of view. You test different permutations of images, adverts, wording, and you test and you test and you test to see what produces the best result. I think people fail to understand this about propaganda. It is a form of marketing technique, except they're not trying to sell you something harmless like shampoo. They're trying to suck out your soul and your brain. But the techniques work at scale like that, don't they? Like some kind of marketing technique.
Yeah, after all, it's all about manipulations and manipulating, making people to make sure people do certain choices, make certain choices. I guess, yeah, there's definitely similarity in it. And it's like same for communications. In any communication, if you promote any brand, you need to repeat it, right? And you need to repeat one message. You don't have to come up with something different every time. So I guess it's not something new, obviously, but it's propaganda, so it's definitely not harmless.
And do you think, I mean, turning to the sort of bigger picture, because I get the impression that Ukraine is developing not full immunity, but it's developing vaccines against propaganda. The world, however, the rest of the world seems to be terribly exposed to Russian propaganda. Perhaps it works slightly less well in the UK, but in countries across Europe, and you've mentioned a few of the key ones there, Serbia, Hungary, Italy, Germany, and even France, Russian propaganda seems to have much more traction. In the US, they adopt different techniques, but also you've got India, Middle East, South America, and of course, China is the big one, because of course, Russian propaganda there is amplified by their local government. Do you see Russian propaganda taking different strategies and different approaches in different parts of the world?
Yeah, as I said, they are good at using something which people already know from their personal experiences, from history, and then trying to say that it's similar in Ukraine. So people tend to simplify things instead of analyzing this particular context of Ukraine. So in Germany, it's World War II normally. In the UK, it would be the Scotland issue and the referendum, and they always try to portray it as something similar to what happened in Crimea, trying to make sure to portray this referendum same as in Scotland, even though it wasn't, and lots of other things. And Ukraine, I feel people are inoculated, like they are vaccinated in some way, that they already know which fake stories are not even worth their attention. So whereas in the West, I feel people still invest their time into debunking certain stories, which in Ukraine and in Finland and Latvia, you know, all these countries who are at the forefront of Russian propaganda, in these countries, people wouldn't even pay attention to those fakes. So they would just come and disappear after some time, not even getting any traction. I guess this is the main difference. I had a talk with Finnish colleagues who work with media literacy and who have been working for already, I don't know, 50 years, 60 years. Finland is one of those advanced countries and most resilient to disinformation according to certain indexes. And they say that, I mean, I asked them, so what are the typical Russian propaganda narratives in there, and what are the most popular fake stories? And he replied, actually, there isn't much. I was surprised to hear that. And then he continued and said, well, because Finnish people in Finland just don't pay attention to those stories because they are super stupid. And so people don't even feel the need to analyze them because they just come unnoticed. So I guess this is a great result. This is something which we would need for every country, to just ignore the stories about Nazis in Ukraine and the Azov who bombarded maternity house. And one of the things which shocked Ukraine was actually Italian TV, RIA, I guess, who not only invited Russian propagandists to speak live. It was Solovyov, I guess, but who also
Solovyov or Simonyan or something like that, yeah.
Solovyov, the key propagandist,
Yeah.
who spoke at Italian TV channel. But apart from that, they traveled to Kremlin, to Moscow, and they made a live report from there. And the TV anchor was standing in front of this Kremlin palace, saying like, this is a history glorifying this, you know, architecture, everything was around him. So basically, serving as a part of this Russian propaganda and this soft power. Ukrainians were very shocked by that, and obviously, there are a lot of questions as to, you know, it might be harmless going to Moscow and reporting from Moscow, but at the same time, he definitely was portraying it as something of a huge importance to the world, as something glorious, and then referring to it as a great culture, not even mentioning the fact that this is the country, this is the center from where the decision about the war was made and stuff like that. So he was just avoiding it. So Italy is a huge, I mean, it's a case which needs to be monitored, I guess, and we need to be more active in Italy. I mean, Ukrainians must try to deliver their narratives better in Italy in particular. But yeah, it's not something which is, you know, which should be happening, obviously. And then, yeah.
I did speak to an expert on Italian media, and I think anyone commenting on the Italian media is quite cautious with their words, because one of the techniques with the propagandists is to sue, and that's nowhere more prevalent than Italy. You know, if you make any specific allegations, you're likely to end up in a court of law. But what they also said is that the penetration of Russian money and Russian influence in the Italian media, it's not accidental, and it's not just one or two reporters, you know, being inaccurate. There is a systematic penetration of the Italian media by the not just propagandists, but of course it would be the GRU as well.
Yeah, same happens with this AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, German far-right party. Because of their links with Russians, they haven't even condemned the war, and they tend to promote the same narrative that this is the US's and NATO's responsibility. So that's definitely, like, what we are seeing is just repeating one of the key Russian propaganda narratives. And there is no like clear evidence of AfD being financed by Russia, but obviously there are some links and some connection.
Definitely. And, you've worked in the UK, you've studied in the UK, and, spend a lot of time here. I think there is a slightly higher threshold or lower tolerance for some of the narratives. But nonetheless, when you watch the UK media, do you see some of those propagandist narratives almost unconsciously slip into, media reports?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the war, there was one narrative which was spread by British tabloids, I guess. So one of them was the racism in Ukraine,
Mm,
when they were telling a story about Ukrainians being racist to foreign students who were trying to flee at the border, and they portrayed it as a tendency rather than a one case.
mm,
And again, it fits in Russia's narrative about Ukraine being a failed state, a country not ready to enter the EU. So it was spread widely by the media. What I'm seeing now is that they try to, this Ukraine blaming sentiment is increasing. I recently came across a targeted ad of an app which helps you calculate your expenses, and they say, look, I will have to pay more for this and that. So by the end of the month, it would be £200 extra. And there is this the war in Ukraine and stuff like that. So they were kind of advertising the app, but at the same time, they were in a hidden way blaming Ukraine for all this increase.
mm.
And even I listened to a podcast by The Guardian, and an expert was telling about this issue with, like our expenses are going to increase and stuff like that. And he was saying there are a couple of reasons for that. And then he says it's, of course, pandemic. And then the second reason is Ukraine. And it might sound harmless, but the way you frame it, you call Ukraine a reason for the hardships the British people will have to go through. And this is already not okay, because how he should have positioned it is that the second reason is Russia's aggression or Russia's war against Ukraine. Even as I said, it's just a matter of words, but it still influences people's perception of the situation. And this is how Russia wants the British people to see it, that this is Ukraine who is not willing to negotiate with Russia and thus makes you suffer. And this is not how Ukrainians see it. Ukrainians see it as an existential war. For us, it's a matter of survival. Negotiating with Russia doesn't make sense, and we had a lesson. So yeah, we know that negotiations don't work. So for us, it's a bit different story. But unfortunately, these narratives are being promoted in the UK as well.
And of course, when you have Russian spokespeople or guests onto media programs, and I watch The Guardian, I watch The Times has a YouTube channel, and generally, they're guests who have, let's say, unconscious biases rather than explicit biases. But of course, with the passing of Gorbachev, quite a few Russian politicians have been invited to make statements or give interviews. And what I find interesting about it is that there is no introduction, there is no warning given that you're about to speak to somebody and this is what they've said in the past, this is what they've done, this is what they believe. They're just introduced as a guest. And I don't exactly recall, I think he was called Mironov, but he was a deputy and quite a prominent deputy in the Russian parliament. And then he proceeded for 20 minutes to, say some extraordinary chauvinist, imperialistic nonsense from a Kremlin point of view. But there was no introduction. And I don't know how you feel about how the role of media literacy can help teach journalists how to better, frame opinions and guests. But when I looked this politician up, he's made extraordinary statements, saying that Butcher was a fake, saying, all the usual kind of nonsense. What lesson is there for journalists here from the work you're doing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just if they invite this type of speakers, there must be some disclaimer, and the journalist must take responsibility of debunking fakes on air, because if they don't do it, if they don't intervene in this avalanche of propaganda narratives, then it means that they provide a platform for this propaganda. And they, as I said, if a person hears certain narratives, even if they know it's a fake, but then they hear it somewhere else, they are more eager to believe it sometime, some in a few days, if they hear it for the third time. So if it's a media which has, I don't know, multi-million audience, they must make sure that if they invite the speakers who are reporters of Russian propaganda, they must have a dialogue with them rather than let them speak for 20 minutes. I guess this is what happened even with BBC, and when Steven Sackur invited someone from the Russian government, and this someone was repeating same Russian narratives. And no matter how hard he tried to present her with the fact, to show the facts and to emphasize some credible sources, she would say, how do you know it's truth? How do you know we can trust the sources? How do you know that even BBC is not lying or CNN is not lying? And this is their typical response. So in the end, in my opinion, Steven Sackur didn't look very, didn't have a proper interaction with this speaker, but rather provided the speaker with a platform to talk. And this is a huge challenge. Yeah.
Fortunately, I'm not a journalist, so I only invite people on the channel who I believe are going to give, truthful answers or give the best answers they can based on their experience. For me, it's an easy approach. I simply won't invite on or speak to people who I know are, have an extraordinary point of view or want to get some kind of purpose across. It's, I guess, more tricky for journalists. My last two questions really relate to how your work fits in with the wider innovation that's happening in Ukraine. The innovation of digital techniques and campaigns and organizations, and a lot of it is kind of self-organizing rather than government sponsored. But how does your effort fit in with this sort of huge set of innovations that are taking place across the sort of counter disinformation ecosystem?
Our work is more about educating people and making sure they understand the need to continuously develop their critical thinking, because technology will be changing. Lots of new platforms will be coming, and then new tools will be coming, and deep fakes are becoming more sophisticated. But what you need to have is a cold head. And then you need to know when you should stop, pause, and think for a second before you share something or before you believe it. So that's the key idea, because you can't make sure people are aware of all the latest technical solutions and innovations and they use it on a regular basis. But what you can help them learn is that they need to exercise their critical thinking every day, in all media they consume, and they need to filter the information they consume. So I guess this is the core idea. Of course, we provide people with the latest, tools, and there were lots of platforms developed during the war, especially by Ukrainian volunteers, and lots of chatbots, which helped people verify information very quickly. And then we also communicated these, deep fakes, which started appearing with Zelensky. And then, of course, they were not perfect, but there is still a risk that later on Russia might come up with something more sophisticated. We communicate that, but this is not the main thing. The main idea is to make sure people develop, do the self-development part, and always seek for self-improvement.
So my last question here, to sort of put that in context. So you're teaching people how to recognize the techniques of propaganda. You're teaching them how to validate, verify information, and you're giving them that sort of knowledge. Is that far more important than just telling them what the propaganda narratives are? Or do you also have to kind of highlight, the latest propaganda narratives in addition to what you're doing?
Yeah, for sure, we highlight this latest propaganda narratives, and they are changing. And those people who are already smart enough, media literate enough, very often they see these tendencies themselves, so they can identify these narratives themselves. But what we do, we of course monitor, and together with the other initiatives in Ukraine, we combine all these narratives and spread them among Ukrainians so that they know all about them. But it's not our main goal. There are two centers in Ukraine: one center for combating disinformation, another one center for strategic communication. So they monitor these narratives, and our task is to make sure people know about them, because sometimes experts community, they tend to think that everyone is as smart as them, so they don't need to go out and talk to people and explain them in a simple way. What Filter does, this is what actually we do: we explain it in a simple way and make sure it reaches even rural audiences, and people know about these narratives and can identify them when reading news.
That's a brilliant summary of what you do, and I'm really grateful that you've made the time to speak to me today. The work you're doing sounds extraordinarily innovative, it's inventive, and clearly it's extremely important to push back against Russian hybrid warfare. I really wish you the best of luck in your ongoing research and campaigns. Slava Ukraini!
Heroям слава. Thank you.